But other comments or questions? Yes.
You mentioned earlier that one way to really enhance ethics in journalism is to get money out, but I feel like that comment privileges mediums that are already established. And as someone who, I'm trying to start my own blog, I don't know how to get money out and still earn a living because I don't have that user base I can turn to and say, support us on Patreon, because they aren't there.
It's more that, as a whole, here's the problem, right? You go to a site like Kotaku, and Kotaku is entirely, I mean, they're ad funded, right? Who buys the ads for video game sites, right? It's video game companies. Not that we have to get money out, we just have to figure out ways to either move it, I mean, to the Patreon model, to the model that is sort of viewer funded, which I think is an amazing thing, or at least move it past the model where the only people who are paying us are the same people we're supposed to review and have oversight over, right? And even as such, I mean, I think as a small writer starting up your own thing, do what you need to do, but keep that in mind as you go further, because if $750 is rent for next month and you need it, it makes it way harder to pan people's game who are going to give you that $750 to do a spread, right? And it's never going to be a perfect system, right? In the ideal world, we can find some way. And this is why, by the way, this is the thing about film criticism. Film criticism survived, thrived, and grew because film critics were embedded in newspapers that weren't solely funded by the film companies. That hasn't happened with games. And so in the abstract, we have to find some way to do that. I don't have a good answer. Yeah, take it off.
Thank you, everyone.
If you see Dan, and we'll do that for as many, everything.
Autograph up there.
Yes, this is an autograph that they want from you, sir.
Okay.
All right, so we had other questions. Go for it.
So in the Games and Mechanics episode, you mentioned that MMOs, as they tell stories, are kind of flawed because of their gameplay, which feels very like unepic and, you know, yeah, finding rat pelts and such. And with like games like the Elder Scrolls Online, which kind of have that big problem, and then all the other Elder Scrolls games make you the central like chosen one, and then an MMO world puts you in a world where like you can't really be the chosen one because there's millions of chosen ones walking around. Is there a better way to do storytelling in MMOs, like where you can interact with your fellow citizens of your MMO?
This is a really good question. So storytelling in MMOs. I think way back we did an episode on storytelling in sort of uncharted worlds, other ways to do storytelling in MMOs. I am a huge fan of, rather than thinking of it as a traditional narrative, think about the story in the MMO as sort of as a mythos, right? As a myth cycle, in the same way that if you go read Greek myths, it's not one story, it's a bunch of stories which just inhere in this world. And I return to EverQuest because I actually think not being constrained by knowing what there was this, I think we talked about this in the episode that we also talked about Secret World. But there's this moment in the first EverQuest where you are fighting a low-level group of gnolls, whatever, you're fighting down into this big pit. When you get to the bottom, there's this lake. And there's like nothing in the lake, there's a couple of piranhas. But if you dive in, periodically you'll find a ring right at the bottom, right? It has a little inscription, it has an inscription described in the text on the ring. And as you go around the world, you start finding out about who this person is, you can talk to NPCs, and it becomes part of this larger myth. And then you find weapons and whole things connected to this, and it expands the world out. And all these pieces are interconnected. A skeleton in a dungeon somewhere isn't just a skeleton in a dungeon somewhere, but connected to somebody in that world. You get their weapon, and it's some famous weapon. And so rather than having one directed story, they make a solid, holistic world that feels like a real world, that has the progression that an individual, a heroic individual, but not the chosen one, in that world could have. And so there's also all these factions and different groups that can see you in different ways. And as you start drifting towards one or the other through the actions you choose, through the moral path you take through the game, you start advancing a storyline within that group, right? Because you may be
a more like personalized storyline.
right, and a smaller one for each of these instances, rather than trying to make you the epic chosen one. This is a world that exists, a holistic world that has this whole myth cycle, that has all these legends, that has all this lore to it. And within that world, small stories can happen. And some of those small stories can star you.
Something that I want to add to that is sometimes you need to find a storyline and a mechanic that can work in an MMO to match the scale of what's actually going on. A random game that I played on the internet, it was a web game. I can't remember the name, but you play as a cat and you just wander around and there's a bunch of other cats and all you can do is meow. But you just wander around and you can see all these other people playing as cats and you wander around the neighborhood and you just discover the neighborhood. It creates the sense of scale and mechanics match what's going on.
Can you please remember the name of this game right now?
It's a silly cat flash.
I feel there's like one game called like Cat the MMO, which is just you wander around, like there's like some secrets and there's like a tree house you can climb in, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, but you're also a cat. So
Can you customize the cat?
no, you can't even type in. You can't chat.
Oh, okay. The one I'm thinking of, there is like kind of a chat.
Yeah, you just type in meow, or everything you say is meow.
Sounds like Journey.
I feel like there's a James recommend somewhere in here.
Carrie would love editing that. Do you think that the massive success of World of Warcraft and the fact that so many games basically went, oh my gosh, World of Warcraft is so successful, just make World of Warcraft with a different skin on it, sort of set, I mean, not to say that World of Warcraft wasn't good, but sort of set the MMO industry back a little bit as far as innovation and trying to craft more interesting worlds and stuff because they were more concerned with, oh, let's make a game that plays like WoW and we'll deal with everything later?
So this is a really interesting point because this is actually one that's sort of essential to our industry. I love World of Warcraft, right? I spent too many hours of my life on World of Warcraft. But I think it was a step back as a player, right? As an aficionado of MMOs, as the player, just in the same way that some art critics may say that. So for those of us who are really into this, really refined, who love deeper mechanical life, yes, it was a step back. There's less there. But in doing so, it was also genius. They did a lot of things, to smooth everything out, to make sure that everybody wins, to make sure that everybody can play this game. That brought in a huge audience. So I understand the genius of it. But as a player, as a personal player, not as a designer, but just as a player, I do think it was a step backwards. And it defining what an MMO was for so long has proved very limiting for the industry. I think we're coming to the tail end of that because with the failure of both Star Wars and what was that?
Wildstar?
Oh, I actually wasn't even thinking Wildstar. I was thinking Elder Scrolls. But yeah, we could go through that list, right? Everybody here can probably call out a different failed WoW MMO.
Right. I want to recommend maybe a good MMO that has the story you might look for would be Guild Wars 2. And that.
I will kibosh debating the quality of MMOs.
It's not about the quality aside. It's more like you're not necessarily the chosen one. It's more like you're a
He-Man stole my story.
machine in a sort of place.
So the story itself is good.
No. Yeah. The story itself is more.
The world is well developed. The story is not that good.
We can argue back and forth about the quality of the narrative. I think that one of the things that we do see though is one of the non-WoW MMOs to survive, Eve, delivers us some awesome stories because it takes a totally different perspective, right? We're going to give the players the tools to establish a rich story for themselves. And so I think as we roll forward, as we get past the paradigm of WoW, we're going to start again seeing exploration in the MMO space. And that will provide us with stories that we didn't expect, perhaps from sources like players that we hadn't traditionally considered.
I feel the same way you did about WoW because of EverQuest, but with me it was Asher's Call. So.
I could, yeah. All right.
With the
time and money it takes to make an MMO, do you see that type of personalization? I mean, you have to convince investors and everything compared to the model that works to something brand new, and it's a lot of money and time to make an MMO. So can you see that happening anytime soon?
So there's a lot of different, right? First off, we have seen Kickstarter projects that could certainly pay for an MMO at this point, right? But more than that, it depends on what you think of as an MMO. When we think of your WoW style MMO, that's just this monumental investment. I totally grant that. But when we think of things like, God, this tells you how tired I am. The guys who made Triple Town, what's the MMO they made? Top-down shooter MMO?
Talking about the one where you get experience just by being in the air, like.
Realm of the Mad God, that's what I was looking for. It tells you. Right, that MMO was made by a small team for next to nothing. Korea is really good at churning out 2D MMOs and cheap 3D MMOs.
Dungeon Fighter.
Right, Dungeon Fighter. There's all these ones that have a massive multiplayer element that don't cost $100+ million. And I think $100+ million budget, you're absolutely right, is very restrictive. And I think that the next wave of MMOs we see in the United States aren't going to see that investor backing because investors have been burnt too often. And so it will force people to innovate in order to produce things that are interesting on less of a budget.
It's a Minesweeper MMO now.
Absolutely. Because the one thing I want with Minesweeper is other people frantically clicking.
I'm like 10, I still don't know how to play that.
I'm going to let you call on people.
Okay, oh, good, my job. Is that your job? Extra card? It is now. DS.
All right. I go to a school that's a little more like politically active. I don't go to game design. We have a programming area, blah, blah, blah. So my question's not about game design. One of the things I get is I feel like I'm with all these smart people, but then I mention video games or something along those lines, and they'll go, let me tell you what the problem is with your thing. And we do have problems. I have feminist friends who are like, your treatment of women is terrible. I have people who are like, your online communities are terrible, and you have people like telling me to go die. And I try to explain, I'm like, well, it's not all like that. And they just tell me like, you're ignoring the problems instead of dealing with them. How do I, and then they're not willing to then come in and be like, no, come play To the Moon with me or something like that, and I'll show you that games can be just as amazing. So how do I talk to someone who's not willing to delve into the material that I have? And then also, how do I debate them without just being like, trying to like push the bad stuff under the rug? I acknowledge it, but I like at the end of the day, I just feel like I'm dancing around it.
So there are two sides. There are a couple of different ways, depending on how directly confrontational, not adversarial, but confrontational you want to be. I was recently talking to a minister of a very large series of churches through Games for Good about some of these things, and he was like, well, you have all these howling, terrible people who have no respect in your, who play video games. And I had to respond, imagine if I called all Christians Westboro Baptist Church, right? And so I just took the example of something from the thing that they care about, because everything has their small, marginal, howling community, right? And we can just compare those two and say, hey, see past that and give it a chance, right? And then the other thing is also to say, look, yes, it has problems, but this is something that reaches hundreds of millions of people. This is the fastest growing medium in the history of humanity. We spend, as a species, more hours every year playing Microsoft Solitaire than it took us to build all the great wonders of the world. So, let's try and make it better together, right? Listen, work with me, come into this community. Yeah.
This is when we have a really bad habit of trying to air our dirty laundry for the world to see. I don't know. I think is there a time where we ever gonna move past that, like despite the fact that it's sort of generates a lot of the news, unfortunately.
What do you mean? Define.
I don't know. It seems like through a lot of how do I'm trying to put this, and I'm not trying. There's nothing to do with hashtag we will not discuss again. Just want to miss the
what we will not discuss. Yeah. Started? I think that as a community, I think we are big enough and strong enough to admit that there are things wrong with this medium and be okay with it. And even to people who accuse this medium of things, say, yes, there are things wrong, but this has great power, and work with us, help us make it better.
Yeah, I think it's just more the way of, is there a way to try to point them in the direction of, better discussions aside from maybe whatever new media hit pieces like you find, like through the Gawker network or so.
So I hate to actually use us, but like I would hope that some of the things we're doing, and there's lots of other people like us out there who are writing really valuable things. Just go to find one place where some kid in a comment about a game or about a video about a game or whatever talks about the fact that it saved his life, right? Because I've talked to kids all the time. I mean, when I was in high school, right, I had my headphones on all the time. I really think, I remember, it's gonna sound silly, but it was Seattle, right? It was Seattle in the 90s, and I remember somebody handed me a tape of Soundgarden and some Nirvana Unplugged, and some of this stuff. And I remember hearing Jesus Don't Want Me for Sunbeam. And I really think that saved my life, right? Without music, I wouldn't have gotten through that particular period. And I mean, games have been that for a lot of us. And anything that can be that powerful should hopefully resonate, right? Say, hey, look, here's somebody who says, this thing is my world. This thing saved my life. Let's use that for as much good as we can.
I think you can also say that, like, this is the thing I'm passionate about, and because of that, I dislike all the negative stuff about the community just as much as you do, or anyone from outside the gaming community who would bring up those sorts of things.
And something else that's been bothering me a lot is that other art forms, other art media, they're almost given carte blanche to do whatever they want. It's like you say anything bad about almost any other form of art, whether it's just pictures, that digital art on the internet, most of the stuff on DeviantArt, or certain branches of the film industry. They're pretty much saying, if you say that there's any sort of inherent problem in those media, they'll look at you and say, well, you just don't get it.
The movies also went through kind of the phase that we went through, we're going through right now, where they had like their kind of time where, oh man, all these movies are like promoting like unethical things and stuff like that, and soon they pushed themselves through that.
And in music, hip hop is still going through.
Comic.
I mean, my favorite is to go all the way back, right? Shakespeare was, reviled low art that was corrupting society, right? So, opera. Opera was the work of the devil.
Don rap chess.
There's so much about corrupting.
Elvis.
So we go through this time and time again. I do think we are starting to get to the point where we should be getting out of this. And one of the issues is that we are slower than almost any other modern industry, the modern film industry, the modern music industry, the modern television industry, any modern art industry, to actually have a lobbying group in Washington. We have ESA, but they don't really function as a lobbying group. They function as a very small lobbying group that does almost very few things for a very select group of publishers and developers within the industry. We haven't all come together to pool money to really fight, to make it hurt, to make us the whipping boy for everything. And so we get that a lot more than some of these other industries as well.
But I'm sorry. It sounded like you were talking about how you engage with people who have these like vehemently anti-whatever. I mean, I've faced that. I think everybody here probably has that. Those people who say, oh, gamers are bad people. I mean, it's a huge sweeping generalization. But I get what you're saying. You want to teach them and say it's not like that. Look at this interesting thing. Look at have somebody play Braid or but don't even say that. Just don't engage with them. If they're not gonna hear you out, then it's not even worth really fighting about. It's just not. It only makes you almost support. They're gonna dig their heels in and say, no, I was right. This guy's an asshole. Look what he's doing to me.
Worst case scenario, and you're just like, you know, you say something to them, that just fuels their fire.
Right, but they're just gonna dig their heels in and say, look at this, I was right the whole time. He's trying to force his demon work on me.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. Because there are ways to approach the topic which can avoid the adversarial standpoint, like James was saying. And I'd like to talk to you directly because this is a problem I face as well. I'm a PhD student. I want to study games in education, so I want to be an advocate for games in a positive sense. But I face all the time people saying, like, best case scenario, what is the value that games have to present to us? Worst case scenario, have you seen Gamergate? And
Hashtag be mentioned.
first off, let me tell you, you're not alone, so don't feel like you have to go through this alone. There's a community out here who can help you handle this. And secondly, I think the key point is finding what the person you're trying to talk to values and what they can relate to, like James was talking about. So, what's your major in school?
Latin American and Hemisphere.
Latin American and Hemisphere. I'm sorry, I have no idea.
Just think Mexico and then everyone else who actually exists.
What I can tell you, for example, my discipline's engineering, and in engineering we have computer science, and one thing I always point out is, in computer science in 1984, the field of computer science drove away women from the field, much the same way the Gamergate debacle is trying to push women away from games right now, and that's something they can relate to. And I can just say, you don't look back at that and say computer scientists are all trash, the field of computer science should just go away. You look back at it and say, what can we learn from that experience and